Hi biologists! Okay, what we're going to do today is we're going to look at the process of transpiration, but before we do that it's really important that you can remember the names of the different types of cells and regions within the leaf. So what I suggest you do is that you pause the video now and you have a go at labelling parts A to H. Just jot your answers down on a piece of paper and then I'll go through them with you in a minute. Okay, so hopefully you had a chance at writing down your answers for A to H. So here are the answers. So part A is the waxy cuticle, and we find that only on the very top part of the leaf, and that's really so that when it rains, water will run off the leaf and won't make the leaf too heavy and snap it. Just underneath that we have the upper epidermis. This is just a layer of clear cells, and then underneath that we have the important cells, the palisade cells. Now, palisade is another name for a fence, and so these cells are meant to represent a kind of fence that you might find in your garden. Really tightly packed cells, absolutely jam-packed with chloroplasts, and this is where most photosynthesis occurs. The layer underneath that, we have the spongy mesophyll cells, and those cells, yes, they do have chloroplasts, but they don't have as many as the palisade cells. But the key thing that they have there in between them is that they have air spaces. On the very bottom layer, okay, the lower epidermis, we've got holes in the leaf called stomata, and surrounding each stoma we have two guard cells. The guard cells can swell or become flaccid to allow those stomata to open and to close. So let's just remind ourselves of what's going on in the leaf. So the main purpose of the leaf is obviously to photosynthesize and to make glucose, sugar for the plant. Okay, so they are transferring light energy into glucose energy. That, as I said just a minute ago, primarily occurs in the palisade cells, but it's also going to occur in the spongy mesophyll cells as well. But what we have there, those key areas, those air spaces, are to allow that gas, that carbon dioxide that's required in photosynthesis, to diffuse from the air into the stomata, into those air spaces, and make its way up to those palisade cells. If we didn't have those air spaces, those palisade cells would not get that carbon dioxide and so wouldn't be able to photosynthesize. It also allows for that waste product, that oxygen, to diffuse back. So that will diffuse back through the air spaces and back out through the stomata. So plants absolutely have to have those stomata on the bottom of their leaves to allow carbon dioxide in and to allow oxygen out. We call that gaseous exchange because the gases are exchanging at that point in the leaf. Carbon dioxide in, oxygen out. Now, having a consequence of having those stomata, unfortunately for the plant, is that water vapour will also leave through the stomata, and we call that the process of transpiration. And if you look at this oak tree here, on a hot sunny day, typically it would lose about 700 litres of water in a day, and that pint there that you can see, a pint of milk there that you might get from Tesco's, that's 1 litre. So you can see how much water is being lost. The plant doesn't particularly want to lose that water, but it's just a consequence of having those stomata. So when we talk about transpiration, we start at the leaves because that is where the water vapour is leaving the plant. It's coming out through those stomata, and what that does is it pulls water up through the stem in special tubes that plants have called Xylem vessels, and then that takes water in from the roots and in from the soil. So we call that flow of water through the plant the transpiration stream, and you need to understand how this works in a little bit more detail. So here on the picture at the top there, we've got the inside of a leaf. Okay, so you've got the lower epidermis at the bottom, you've got your guard cells and you've got your stomata, and then you've got those spongy mesophyll cells with the air spaces in between. And what happens is that water will evaporate from those cells, okay, within the leaf, the spongy mesophyll cells into those spaces, and then it will just diffuse as water vapour out through the stomata. Now it's important that you use the word water vapour there. If you say water, you kind of have thoughts of water dripping out of the leaves. That doesn't happen. At this point here, the water has evaporated, so it's now a gas and it's water vapour. The cell that it's evaporated from, okay, into the airspace, so that spongy mesophyll cell, now has less water in it than the cell next door. And so, because of osmosis, which is the movement of water from a high to a low water concentration, that water will then move from the cell next door into that cell that's lost the water. Then that cell that it's just moved from now has less water, so water will move into that one from the cell next door, and that happens all the way along the leaf until we get to that middle part of the plant, the stem, which contains these vessels called xylem vessels. So water is then pulled all the way up those xylem vessels which are inside the stem. At the bottom of the xylem now, there's no water because it's obviously shifted up towards the leaves, and so then water will move into the xylem from the cells in the roots just around the bottom of the xylem. That water will move into the xylem, and so that cell now has less water, so water will move in from the cell next door and all the way along until it gets to the root hair cell. Once we get to the root hair cell, then water will pass in from the soil into the root hair cell, again by either osmosis, or at this point here it could happen by diffusion. If you imagine the cell walls on the plant cells, on the root hair cells, are like paper, because actually that's what paper's made from, plants. And so if you have a drop of water on paper, quickly you can see it spread through the water, and it just spreads by diffusion. And so water can enter the root hair cell just along those cell walls by diffusion, or it can move into the cytoplasm of the cell by osmosis. Okay, so let's have a look at what these xylem vessels are like. They are basically long tubes inside the stem, a bit like straws, which go from the bottom of the stem all the way to the top of the stem. Now, they used to obviously be cells, but end to end to end, but what's happened is that those cells have died and the ends of the cells have broken down to make this one hollow tube. So they are dead tissue. They're no longer living. They have a tough outer wall, and they are covered in this material called lignin, which is waterproof, and so therefore it stops the water from passing out of those xylem vessels as it's being transported up the stem of the plant. The water can only go in one direction. Of course, it's going to go upwards, and dissolved in that water, we're going to also have some mineral ions. Now, these are tough cells, or dead cells, and so they do also provide support for the stem of the plant and help to keep that stem upright. If you've got any celery lying around at home, this is quite a nice little experiment to do. You just put some celery into some coloured water, so some water with some food dye, for instance, and if you leave it for a day, you'll notice that the dye will start to pass up through those xylem vessels inside the stem. And if you slice it through, like it's shown on this picture here, you can see clearly where the xylem vessels were in these celery stems. Okay, so the last little bit of this is what things are going to cause transpiration to get faster. So on this slide here, I've put a picture of a leaf up there just to remind you. So transpiration, remember, is caused by water evaporating from the cells in the leaf and leaving through those stomata. So really what we're looking at are things that are going to increase water evaporation from the leaf. If water evaporation increases, then obviously transpiration is going to increase. So we've got 4 things listed here. First one is light. So when it's really bright light, during the day, then the stomata will open because we want to get that carbon dioxide in so that the plant can photosynthesize. But of course, having more stomata open or stomata open wider means that we are going to lose more water vapour. Temperature. On a hot day, of course, water is going to evaporate more quickly, and so transpiration is going to be faster. When it's windy, what happens there is the water vapour that has evaporated and just passed out of the leaf through the stomata is blown away by the wind. And so therefore we now have a region just outside the stomata where there's no water vapour at all. We've got water vapour inside the leaf in those air spaces, and so we have a concentration gradient. We have high water vapour concentration inside the leaf, low water vapour concentration outside the leaf, and so more water vapour will diffuse through those stomata, and then of course it gets blown away and it continues. On a still day, it just sits. The water vapour sits around the outside of the stomata, and so actually we don't have a very big gradient from the inside to the outside, and so less water vapour then leaves. The other thing which is quite similar to this is humidity. So you know when it's one of those days where it's kind of wet and muggy and it feels like it's going to rain, that means that there's a lot of water vapour in the air. If we've got a lot of water vapour in the air, the same thing happens as before. We don't have a very big gradient of water vapour from the inside and the outside, so less water vapour will leave.